You want to know the one rule that scared warlords kept on their walls. Not don't cross the Sithari, not pay your debts to the Iron Choir. None of that. It was 3 words. Never hunt humans. And the strangest part, the part that still makes my hands go cold when I tell it, is who wrote that rule. It wasn't a human. It wasn't some peace council or some soft-spoken diplomat. It was the most feared killer this galaxy ever produced. A creature that had ended whole bloodlines for a fee. And he carved those 3 words into the hull of his own ship so he would never forget. I know because I was there the night he explained why. Let me start from the beginning. My name doesn't matter much. People on Drenaway Station called me Old Sib, mostly because I was the only one who'd been there longer than the rust. I tended the lower lifts. Cargo cradles, mostly, those huge magnetic arms that swing crates from the docking rings down into the gut of the station. Boring work. Good work if you like being invisible. And I like being invisible. Drenaway wasn't a place you ended up by choice. It hung in orbit around a star that had died a long time ago, a cold cinder of a thing that gave off just enough light to make the station look gray instead of black. The whole place was built into a captured asteroid, hollowed out over centuries by miners who'd long since moved on. What was left was a kind of crossroads, a way station, the last honest dock before the lawless rim and the first dirty bar after it. You came to Drenaway when you didn't want to be found. I'd seen every kind of being pass through those rings. The tall, blue-skinned traders from the Velt Cluster who never looked you in the eye because their religion said eyes were doors. The little chittering Koran merchants who could sell you your own boots and make you grateful. Bounty crews, smugglers, pilgrims. Once, a whole choir of singing machines that had escaped a dead foundry and just wanted somewhere quiet to wind down. And in all those years, in all that traffic, I never once saw a human. That should tell you something looking back. I didn't think about it then. But humans were rare out on the rim, rare like a calm day in a storm season. You heard about them. You heard stories, but you didn't see them. They kept to their own lanes, their own quiet little corner of the spiral, and the rest of us were happy to let them. I used to think that was because humans were weak, soft, slow, short-lived. A species that hadn't even left their first system until the rest of the galaxy was already old. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. The night it happened, I was working a double on the lower lift because Tev, the other lift tender, had gotten himself stabbed over a card game and was lying in the medbay leaking lubricant and pride in equal measure. So it was just me, the hum of the magnetic cradles, and the low, constant groan of the station settling around me like an old animal trying to get comfortable. It was cold. It was always cold on the lower deck. The heat rose to the upper rings where the money was, and what trickled down to us was the kind of thin, recycled chill that gets into your joints and stays there. I had a heater coil I kept under my chair, an old thing held together with wire and stubbornness, and I remember I'd just gotten it glowing when the long-range chime went off. A ship was coming in. Now ships came in all the time. That wasn't news. What made me look up was the sound the chime made. There's a tone the docking system uses for a normal vessel, friendly, almost cheerful. And there's another tone, lower, slower, like a bell tolling underwater, that the system uses when something massive is on approach. Something that needs the big cradles. Something that pays the big fees. I hadn't heard that tone in 2 years. I pulled myself up to the observation slit. It's just a band of reinforced glass that lets the lift tenders watch the docking, make sure nothing scrapes, nothing tears. I wiped the frost off it with my sleeve and looked out into the dark. And there it was. I want to describe this ship to you properly, because the ship was the first warning, and nobody on Drenaway listened to it. It came out of the black slow. Too slow. Most captains burn in hot and proud, showing off the lines of their vessel, the colors, the kill marks. This one drifted in like it had all the time in the universe, like it didn't care who saw it or what they thought. It was long and low, and the color of an old bruise, that deep gray purple you only get from hull plating that's been burned and scarred and patched so many times it stopped being any one color at all. It had no markings, no registry, no name on the side. But it had marks. As it slid past the floodlights, I saw them, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scratched and burned into the hull. I'd seen kill marks before. Every bounty crew kept a tally. But these weren't tallies. These were names. Whole names in dozens of scripts, some of them in languages I'd never seen, etched deep into the metal like scars that someone wanted to keep. And along the spine of the ship, biggest of all, in a script I could actually read 3 words. I didn't understand them then. I will tell you what they were later, because that's the order the night gave them to me, and I want you to feel it the way I did. The cradle reached out, the big arm. It groaned as it took the weight, and I felt the whole lower deck shudder. This ship was heavy, heavier than its size should have allowed, like it was carrying something dense, something terrible in its bones. I keyed the dock log out of habit. Vessel arriving, mass class 4, crew count. The system stalled. Crew count 1. 1. A ship that big, carrying that much weight, scarred with that many names, and only one living thing aboard. I remember I laughed, a nervous little laugh, the kind you make when something is wrong and you don't want to admit it. 1 crew, probably a sensor error, probably a smuggler running cold, hiding his people behind shielding. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things that night that turned out to be wrong. You have to understand what Drenaway's upper deck was like, so you understand the crowd that this stranger walked into. The main concourse was a long curving gallery, ringed with bars and stalls and little cages of light where vendors sold whatever the rim had coughed up that week. There was a place called the Long Drop, which was the biggest bar, run by a 4-armed Geshen woman named Oru who could pour 6 drinks at once and break up a fight without spilling any of them. That's where everyone ended up eventually. That's where the night happened. And that night the Long Drop was loud. There was a bounty crew in town, a loud one. They called themselves the Red Tide, which I always thought was a stupid name, but nobody asked me. 6 of them, all young, all hungry, all the kind of dangerous that comes from being good enough to survive a few jobs and not yet smart enough to be afraid. Their leader was a Sethari named Vask. I knew Vask a little. Everyone did. The Sethari are apex predators, the real thing. Back on their homeworld they hunted things the size of buildings, and it shows. They're tall, they move wrong, too smooth, too sudden, and they've got those eyes that don't blink and those teeth they never quite hide. Vask was young for a captain, but he carried himself like he'd already won everything worth winning. He had a trophy belt, actual trophies, bits of the things he'd hunted, claws and teeth, and one long curved horn that he liked to tap when he was thinking. That night the Red Tide was celebrating. They'd brought in a big score, some defector wanted by the choir, and they'd been paid well, and they were drunk on it and on Oru's worst liquor, and they were talking loud about what they'd hunt next. I wasn't there for the start of it. I heard the start later, pieced it together from Oru and from a Velt trader who'd been at the next table and who never stopped shaking afterward. But I know how it went. Vask was bragging. That was his nature. He was going on about the things he'd killed, the species he'd run down, the trophies he was going to add. And one of his crew, a little reptilian thing named Sliss who laughed at everything Vask said, asked him what was the rarest hunt, the hardest, the one that would make a name. And Vask grinned that terrible Sethari grin and said the word. Humans. The bar didn't go quiet, not yet. Most of them didn't even know what the word meant. Humans were a rumor out there, a story you told to scare new pilots. But the few who knew, the older ones, the ones who'd been around, they shifted. The Velt trader told me he felt his stomach drop, and he didn't even know why, just instinct. Just some old animal part of him that heard the word and wanted to leave. Vask kept going. He said there was a bounty, there's always a bounty somewhere on something, and that a human pelt, a human skull, a human anything was worth more on the trophy markets than a year of normal work. He said he'd heard humans were soft, slow, short-lived. He said they were prey that thought it was a predator, and that was the best kind because they didn't run, they stood and fought and lost, and a kill like that was worth 10 that ran. He said the red tide was going to be the crew that opened up the human lanes, that they'd be the first to make a real industry of it. He raised his glass, and from the dark end of the bar a voice said, "No, you won't." I came up the lift right about then. The cradle was secured, the big ship was locked in, and protocol said I had to log the captain's arrival in person, get a thumbprint, or a claw mark, or whatever the captain used on the dock manifest. So I rode the lift up into the noise and the light, grumbling about the cold in my joints, and I stepped out into the concourse just as that voice cut through the long drop like a blade through cloth. I want to describe the voice, because it was the second warning. It wasn't loud, that's the thing. In a bar full of shouting it should have drowned, but it didn't. It came up under the noise, low and even and patient, the way deep water moves under waves, and every being in that bar heard it. I saw heads turn. I saw the music machine in the corner falter on a note. I saw Oru's 4 hands all stop at once. The voice belonged to the only being at the dark end of the bar. A single figure, sitting alone, that I would have sworn wasn't there a moment before. He'd taken the worst table in the place, the one in the corner by the recycler vents where nobody sat, and he'd been there long enough to have a drink in front of him that he hadn't touched. I couldn't see much of him at first. He wore a long coat, dust-colored, hooded, the kind that hides the shape of what's underneath. But I could see his hands folded on the table, and they were the wrong color for any species I knew. A deep slate gray, almost black at the knuckles, with skin that looked thick, layered, scarred. They were big hands, patient hands, the kind of hands that had done a lot and weren't bothered by any of it. Vask turned slowly. The Sethari don't like being interrupted. His crew went still around him, hands drifting toward the weapons they all carried, that animal stillness coming over the whole table. "You said something?" Vask asked. "I did," the figure said. He still hadn't looked up. He was looking at his folded hands. "I said you won't hunt humans, you won't do it." Vask laughed. His crew laughed with him, that nervous, echoing laugh of people who follow a dangerous leader and have learned to laugh when he does. "And who," Vask said, "is going to stop me? You." The figure was quiet for a moment. Then he reached up and pulled back his hood. "I have tried for a long time to describe what I saw, and I have never gotten it right. So I'll just tell you the plain things and let you make the rest." He was old. You could see it in the way the light moved over him, that deep, settled oldness that's beyond age, the oldness of something that has been worn down by use into something harder than it started. His skin was that slate gray, thick and plated along the jaw and the brow, scarred in 100 places. He had a wide, heavy face, blunt, almost gentle, with a broad, flat nose and a mouth that didn't show teeth. Not a predator's face. Not at first. But his eyes. His eyes were pale, almost white, and they were the flattest, calmest, most patient eyes I had ever seen on a living thing. They didn't dart. They didn't blink much. They didn't have that hunger that Vask's had, that fever. They just looked slow and total, taking everything in and giving nothing back. I didn't know his species. Nobody did. That was part of his legend, that no one could say what he was, where he came from, what world had made him. But I knew his name the moment I saw those marks on the hull, and now, looking at the face, the name came up in me like cold water. Thren. Not a species. A name. The Thren. The gray contract. The one warlords paid not to be hunted by. The mercenary who had no flag, no crew, no master, who took jobs that no one else would touch and finished them every time, who had been killing for longer than most species in that bar had been civilizations. They said he'd ended the Ver dynasty single-handed. They said he'd hunted a war god of the choir through the bones of a dead moon and brought back its head in a sack. They said a lot of things, and most of them were probably lies, but the fear was real. The fear was true, and the fear was sitting in the corner of the long drop with a drink it hadn't touched. I saw Vask realize it. I saw it move across his face. That terrible Sethari confidence flickered just for a second, and underneath it I saw the animal, the prey animal that lives inside every predator, the part that knows when something bigger has walked into the clearing. But Vask was young and proud and drunk, and he had his crew watching. So he smiled and he tapped the curved horn on his trophy belt and he said, "The Thren, so the stories are true, the Grey himself drinking alone in a hole like this." He spread his arms. "And here I thought you'd be bigger." The Thren looked at him for a long, long moment. "Sit down," he said. "I'll tell you why you won't hunt humans, and then you can decide if you still want to die proving me wrong. Now here's the thing I have never been able to explain. Vask should have killed him, or tried to. The Red Tide was 6 guns and the Thren was one old creature with a drink. That's the math, and the Rim runs on math. By every rule of that life, Vask should have given the order and let his crew open up and dealt with the legend the way the Rim deals with everything, with violence, fast and total. He didn't. He sat down. I think, and I've had years to think about it, I think it was because somewhere under all that pride, Vask was a hunter, a real one, and a real hunter knows that the most dangerous moment isn't when the prey runs. It's when the prey turns around and looks at you and isn't afraid. The Thren wasn't afraid. The Thren was the calmest thing in that whole bar, calmer than the recyclers, calmer than the dead star outside. And that calm reached into Vask and pulled him down into a chair like a hand on his shoulder. The rest of the Red Tide stayed standing, weapons half drawn, looking at each other. "All of you," the Thren said, not raising his voice. "Sit, or leave, but don't stand there twitching. It's distracting and I'm trying to save your lives." They sat. I should have gone back down to the lift. I had my log. I didn't need to be there. But I didn't move. I leaned against the lift door in the shadow of a vendor stall and I watched, because some part of me knew, the same animal part that had made the Velt trader's stomach drop, that I was about to hear something I would carry for the rest of my life. Oru drifted over with her 4 arms and set a fresh drink in front of the Thren, quiet, careful, the way you'd set down food near a sleeping beast. He nodded to her, just a small nod, and she went back behind the bar and didn't pour another drink the whole time he talked. The long drop went still. The music stopped. The crowd, without anyone telling them to, drew in close, a ring of strange faces in the low light, all of them leaning toward the corner where the old killer sat. And the Thren told his story. "I'll tell you," he said, "about the last contract I ever took to hunt a human, because it was the last. And when you understand why it was the last, you'll understand the rule." He turned the drink slowly in his big gray hands. He didn't drink it. "This was a long time ago, longer than your grandsire's grandsire. The humans were newer to the stars then, they just started reaching past their own little cluster, just started showing up in the lanes where the rest of us lived. And the rest of us did what the galaxy always does with something new. We sized it up. We asked the only question this galaxy ever really asks." He looked up, those pale eyes moving slow across the table. "Is it predator or is it prey?" He let that sit. "And the humans," he said, "looked like prey. They were small, soft-bodied, no plates, no scales, no claws worth the name. Slow to breed, slow to grow, dead in less than a century. Their senses were weak. They couldn't see in the dark. They couldn't smell a thing. They broke easy. You could kill one with a fall, with a cold, with bad water. Compared to a Sethari, compared to a choir war form, compared to me, they were nothing. A joke. A thing the galaxy had made by accident and forgotten to clean up." Vask's mouth twitched toward a smile. "So I was right." "You were right about what they look like," the Thren said. "You were wrong about everything that matters, but you're not the first. The whole galaxy was wrong in exactly the same way all at once. And so a market opened up, same as the one you're dreaming about right now. Humans were rare, and rare is valuable, and a thing that looks like easy prey and sells like rare treasure, that's the best business there is. For a while. He turned the glass. I took the contract because the money was absurd. A consortium doesn't matter who, they're all dead now, wanted a specific human. Not a random one. A specific one. A woman. They gave me a name, a face, a last known position out on the far edge of the human lanes, in a system so small it didn't have a name, just a number. And they wanted her alive if possible, dead if not, and they were paying enough that I'd have done it either way and not lost sleep. Why her? Sliss asked, the little reptilian one. It was the first time any of the crew had spoken since they sat down. The Thren looked at Sliss for a moment. That, he said, is the right question, and I'll get to it, because the answer to why her is the reason I carved 3 words into my ship. When in cold, the Thren said, quiet, the way I always do. I'm not a brawler, that's a young being's game, and you only play it until something faster comes along. I'm a hunter, the real kind. I learn the prey before I ever lay eyes on it. I learn how it thinks, how it moves, what it loves, what it fears, where it'll run and where it'll make it stand. By the time I arrive, I usually know the prey better than it knows itself. That's how you do it forever. That's how you get old in this work. He turned the glass. So before I ever burned for that system, I studied humans, everything I could find, and the more I read, the stranger it got. Strange how? Vask asked. He was leaning in now too. The hunter in him couldn't help it. Their history, the Thren said. I'd read the histories of 100 species. They all follow the same shape, more or less. A species claws its way up, fights itself for a while, settles into something stable, goes to the stars, and either makes peace with the galaxy or gets eaten by it. Predictable. Even the Sethari, he nodded at Vask, even your people, proud as you are, your history reads like everyone else's. Rise, conquer, settle, expand. The same song. And humans. Humans, the Thren said, should not exist. He set the glass down, both hands flat on the table. By every rule of how a species survives, they should have died 100 times over. They lived on a single world for almost their entire history, one world, one fragile shell of air and water, and they spent that whole history trying to wipe themselves out. They split into 1,000 tribes that hated each other for reasons so small I couldn't translate them. They made weapons that could crack their own planet, and then they built thousands of them and pointed them at each other and lived like that. For generations, balanced on the edge of total death, every single one of them knowing they might die in fire before morning. He shook his head slow. And here's the part I read 3 times because I thought the translation was broken. They knew. They weren't ignorant beasts stumbling toward extinction. They understood completely that they were one mistake away from ending their entire species. They wrote about it. They sang about it. They taught it to their young. And they kept going anyway. They kept building, kept reaching, kept reproducing, kept hopping, in the full knowledge that it might all be ash by sundown. The bar was silent. I have hunted things that feared death so much they'd betray their own broods to live an hour longer, the Thren said. I have hunted war gods who'd never lost and broke the instant they understood they might. And here was this soft little species that lived its whole infancy in the shadow of its own grave, and it didn't break. It didn't go quiet. It got louder. It made art. It made jokes. It made children. In the dark, under the weapons, it laughed. He looked up. That should have been my first warning. A thing that doesn't fear death the way everything else fears death, that thing is not prey. I knew that. I'd known it for 1,000 years. And I told myself it didn't matter because the money was absurd and because she was just one and one is always easy. He almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. One is never easy, not with them. I'd learned that too. I want to stop here and tell you what was happening in the bar, because the story was only half of it. The Thren talked slow. He took long pauses, the kind that make you lean forward, the kind that pull the words out of you before he says them. And in those pauses the crowd grew. I swear beings came in off the concourse who couldn't possibly have known what was happening, drawn in by I don't know, by the stillness, by the weight of it. The long drop filled up until there wasn't room to move, and not one of them made a sound. Traders, smugglers, pilgrims, station rats like me, all packed in shoulder to shoulder, all leaning toward one gray old killer in the corner. And the red tide, the six of them, had changed. When they sat down, they were a pack, loose and arrogant, ready to laugh at the old fool. Now they were six beings sitting very still, listening to a hunter older than their bloodlines explain a thing that frightened him. And if it frightened him, I saw Sliss, the little reptile, glance at the door, just a flick of the eyes, already wanting out, already smarter than his captain. Vask didn't glance at the door. Vask was caught. The hunter in him had taken the bait, and the bait was a story, and the hook was set deep. "Tell it," Vask said, and his voice had lost its edge. "Tell the rest." The Thren picked up his glass, looked at it, set it down again. "I burned for that nameless system," he said. 3 weeks cold. No engines, no signature, drifting in on the dark like a stone. I came into the system from above the plane where nobody watches, and I found her world. A little place. Half terraformed, barely. A frontier rock at the very edge of where humans had reached, the kind of place a species sends its most stubborn to die. A few thousand colonists. Domes and dust and machines older than they should have been, kept running by hands that refused to let them stop. And the woman. I found her in a day. She wasn't hiding. That surprised me, a target worth that much money, living out in the open, no guards, no walls. She ran a repair yard on the edge of the main settlement, fixed the machines that kept the colony alive, the air scrubbers, the water cyclers, the old reactors. Everyone in that colony depended on her, and she lived in a little metal house with a light always on in the window, and she did not act like a being with a price on her head. The Thren paused a long time. I watched her for 9 days before I moved. That's the part I keep coming back to. 9 days. I'd never watched a target that long. There was no need. I had her name, her face, her position, an open shot 6 times over. But something held me. Some old hunter's instinct that said, "Not yet, look longer, you are missing something." "And were you?" Vask asked. "Yes," the Thren said. "I was missing all of it." On the 3rd day, the Thren said, a storm came. The dust storms on that world were monsters, wind that could strip the paint off a hull, dust fine enough to choke a reactor. The colony battened down. Everyone went into the domes and sealed up and waited it out. That's what you do. That's the smart thing. The storm could last hours or days, and going out in it was a good way to die alone in the dark, lungs full of grit, never found. He turned the glass. On the 4th hour of that storm, her light went out. The light in the window. The light in the window. And then I watched her come out of her little metal house, into a storm that could kill her, in a suit that was older than she was, with a toolkit on her back. And she walked out into the dark toward the colony's main scrubber array. The thing that made the air. It had failed in the storm. I could see it on my own scans. The air recyclers stuttering. The colony's breathable atmosphere starting slowly to go bad. He leaned back. "Now, here is what any sane being does. You wait. The storm passes eventually. You fix the scrubber after. Maybe the air gets thin and unpleasant, maybe a few of the old and the young struggle, but you survive because you didn't walk into a killing storm. That's the calculation. That's what every species I've ever known would do. Weigh the risk. Wait for the odds." "But she didn't wait," Vask said. "It wasn't a question." "She didn't wait," the Thren said, "because the math she was doing wasn't the math the rest of us do. The rest of us asked, what are my odds of surviving the storm? She asked a different question. She asked, who dies if I wait? And the answer was the ones who couldn't hold their breath. The young, the sick, the ones in the medical dome with bad lungs. And the moment she had that answer, the first question stopped mattering to her. Completely. It just fell away." He spread his big gray hands. "I have hunted 10,000 things. I have never once seen a creature do that. Walk into its own death calmly, with a toolkit on its back, because some other creatures it wasn't even related to might struggle to breathe. Not its own brood. Not its mate. Strangers. People she fixed machines for. And she went out into that storm for them like it was the only thing a person could possibly do." The Thren looked around the silent bar. I followed her, he said. I don't know why. I told myself it was to take the shot when she was isolated. The truth is I had to see if she'd actually do it. Part of me didn't believe it. Part of me thought she'd turn back the moment the storm hit her, the way anything sane would. She didn't turn back, Sliss whispered. She didn't turn back, the Thren said. She got to the scrubber array. The wind was screaming I could barely hold position, and I'm built to hold position in anything. She climbed the tower in the dark with the dust tearing at her, and she opened the failed unit and she put her hands inside a machine that could have torn them off, and she fixed it. In the storm, half blind, alone. And the readouts on my scope climbed back up, and the colony's air came back. And somewhere in those domes, a few thousand strangers kept breathing, and never even knew how close they'd come or who had paid for it. He stopped. And then, the Thren said, the tower gave way. The bar didn't breathe. The storm had weakened the base of the array, the Thren said. Old metal, no maintenance, 50 years passed when it should have been replaced. These colonists kept everything running on hope and patches. You understand, they had nothing else. The scrubber came back online. The colony was saved, and the strain of it, or the wind, or just bad luck, brought the whole tower down, with her on it. He turned the glass slow. She fell about 40 meters into the dark. I lost her in the dust, and I sat there in my ship, in the screaming storm, with the contract in my head and the money in my future, and I did something I had not done in 1,000 years. What? Vask said. His voice had gone very quiet. I went to find her. The Thren's pale eyes moved across the crowd. Not to take the shot. The shot was done, she'd be dead from the fall or dying, and the contract said dead if not. I had what I came for, and the storm was killing my own systems. Every rational part of me said, leave, you're paid, go. And I climbed out of my ship into a storm that was scratching the armor off my hull, and I walked into the dark and the grit toward where she'd fallen because... He stopped. For the first time all night, the Thren looked like he was struggling for a word. Because I had to know what she was, he said finally. I had hunted a thing I didn't understand, and I could not leave that system without understanding it. It was the worst kind of weakness, and I'd never felt it before, and it changed everything that came after. He picked up the glass. This time he drank, one long swallow. He set it down empty. I found her at the base of the tower, he said. Broken. Her suit torn open, her body wrecked, half buried in the drift already. By every measure of my own kind, she should have been dead. She was so small, so soft, lying there in the dark with the storm trying to bury her, this little creature that had walked into its own death to keep strangers breathing. He looked up, and then she opened her eyes. He let that hang in the silent bar. She opened her eyes, the Thren said, and she looked up at me, the thing that warlords pay tribute to so they can sleep at night, standing over her in the dark, and do you know what she did? Nobody moved, nobody breathed. She wasn't afraid, the Thren said. She looked up at the most feared killer in this galaxy dying in the dust, and she wasn't afraid. She was worried about the scrubber. Her first words to me, broken, bleeding, dying, her first words were to ask if the air had come back on, if the colony was breathing. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't ask for help. She asked if the strangers she died for were going to live. The Thren's pale eyes had something in them now that hadn't been there at the start. And I told her yes, the air was back, the colony was fine, they were breathing. He paused. And she smiled, he said. This wrecked, broken, dying little creature smiled, like that was all she'd ever wanted, like that made the whole thing worth it. And then she said the thing that I carved into my ship. She said it to me. The galaxy's most feared mercenary, kneeling in the dust over the prey I'd been paid a fortune to kill. The Thren stopped. He looked at Vask. He looked at the whole packed, silent bar. You want to hear what she said, he said. All of you, I can feel it. You're leaning in for it like it's the end of the story. A long, slow pause. It isn't the end, it's barely the middle. Because what happened after she said it, what her people did, what they taught me about what humans are, that's the part that made me put down the contract forever. That's the part that made the rule. He turned the empty glass in his big gray hands. And I'll tell you that part, the Thren said. But not yet. First, I want you to understand who else was in that storm, because I wasn't the only hunter who'd come for the colony that night, and what happened when the others arrived. He stopped. He looked toward the door of the long drop, and his pale, calm, patient eyes went very, very still. Well, the Thren said softly, it seems I won't have to tell that part after all. You can watch it happen instead. And every head in that bar turned toward the door. Every head in that bar turned toward the door. And I'll be honest with you. After everything the Thren had said, after the storm and the broken woman in the dust, I think we all expected a monster. I think some part of me braced for the door to come apart, for something huge and terrible to fill the frame. The story had wound us all so tight that we were ready for the worst thing in the galaxy to walk in. The door opened, and a human walked through it. One human, small, tired, just a person in a worn flight jacket the color of old rope, with a courier's satchel over one shoulder and dust on his boots. He had short dark hair gone gray at the edges and a face that had been awake too long. He wasn't armed that I could see. He wasn't dangerous looking. He was the most ordinary thing that had come through that door all year. He stopped the way anyone stops walking into a room that's gone suddenly silent. You could see him feel it, the weight of 200 sets of eyes, the strange stillness, the music dead. He froze for half a breath. Then he did what tired people do. He decided it wasn't his problem. He just wanted a drink and a place to sit before his next jump. He walked to the far end of the bar, set down his satchel, and said something to Oru in that flat human way. Quiet, polite, no idea, none at all, of what he'd walked into. I looked at Vask, and I felt the cold come up through the floor of me. Because Vask was looking at the human the way a starving thing looks at meat. That fever was back in his eyes, worse than before. The whole story the Thren had told, the rare prey, the trophy worth a year of work, the species that looked like easy money, it had built a hunger in him, and now the hunger had a face. A small, tired, ordinary face that had just sat down 12 steps away and ordered a drink. Sliss saw it too. The little reptile leaned toward his captain and hissed something low, and I caught the end of it, the one he's been talking about, right there, alone. The Thren watched all of this with those pale, patient eyes. There, he said quietly, you see, I told you, I won't have to describe what happens when someone decides to hunt a human. He turned the empty glass in his big gray hands. You're all about to find out whether you've learned anything. So let me finish the story fast, because how it ends matters a great deal to that man's next few minutes and to yours. I knelt over her in the storm, the Thren said, and his voice dropped, and the bar leaned in around the human who didn't know he was the center of everything. Mara, that was her name. I learned it later. She lay there broken in the dust, having just kept 3,000 strangers breathing, and she looked up at me, at the thing the contract had sent, and she knew. She knew what I was. You could see it in her eyes. She'd worked out in the last clear minute of her life exactly what had come for her and why. He paused. And she didn't beg, she didn't curse me, she didn't ask me to save her, she knew that was past. She used her last clear words to warn me, the killer. Do you understand how strange that is? She spent her dying breath trying to protect the creature that had hunted her down. What did she say? Vask asked. His voice was almost gentle now, almost afraid. The Thren was quiet for a moment. She said, whatever they're paying you, it isn't enough. You don't know what we are yet. You think you killed something small. He let the words settle. But we always come back for our own. Always. You just started a thing you can't finish. He turned the glass. And then she was gone, just like that. The light went out of her the way it goes out of all of them, fast. No drama, here and then not. This soft little creature that had walked into a killing storm for strangers, dead in the dust at my feet, having used her last words to pity me. The Thren looked up, and his pale eyes moved slowly across the silent bar. I almost laughed, he said. We always come back for our own. I'd heard the brave little speeches of dying things before. Every species has them. They mean nothing. The dead don't come back and the living move on and the galaxy forgets. I had a contract complete and a fortune waiting and a corpse to confirm. I stood up to leave. He stopped. And that, he said, is when I learned she wasn't bluffing, because she wasn't the only one who'd come to that colony to die that night, and I wasn't the only hunter in the storm. There was another crew in that system, the Thren said. I'd known about them. Sloppy work, they came in loud, signatures blazing the way young hungry crews do. They called themselves the Ash Feeders, a bulk outfit. Their leader was a thing named Gaul, and where I'd been hired for one specific human, Gaul had taken a different kind of contract entirely. He turned the glass. The same consortium that hired me and others like them had done the math you're doing right now, Sethari. They'd looked at humans and seen easy prey and a rich market, and they decided not to take one at a time. They decided to take a colony, all of it. A few thousand humans on a nameless rock at the edge of the lanes, no defenses, no fleet, no one watching. Harvest the lot, sell what's sold, burn the rest, open the trade. The Ash Feeders were the muscle for it, and they came down out of the storm the same night I knelt over Mara, in 3 heavy dropships, 40 guns, armored, fed, and certain. The Thren's pale eyes were very still. I watched it from a ridge above the colony. I'm ashamed to tell you that. I watched, because the contract was Mara, not the colony, and the colony wasn't my business, and I'd learned 1,000 years ago not to make other beings' deaths my business unless I was paid for it. So I watched the Ash Feeders hit a settlement of farmers and engineers and machinists, and I waited for it to be the slaughter it should have been. He stopped. It was not a slaughter. Here is what Gaul expected, the Thren said. He expected what you'd expect, what I expected. He expected prey. You hit a soft target hard and fast, you panic it, and panic prey scatters, it runs, it hides, it dies in 1s and 2s in the dark, and you collect at your leisure. That's how it's always gone. That's how it went with every soft species the galaxy ever harvested. You break their nerve and the rest is bookkeeping. He shook his head slowly. The humans did not scatter. What did they do? Sliss whispered. They went home, the Thren said. When the dropships came down and the guns came out, the humans of that colony did not run into the dark. They ran toward their houses, toward the domes where their old ones were, where their young ones were. And then they came back out and they were not unarmed anymore. He turned the glass. They were engineers, you understand, machinists, people who kept a dying colony alive on patches and stubbornness. And it turns out that the same hands that fix an air scrubber in a storm can turn a mining laser into a weapon in about 90 seconds. The same minds that nurse a 50-year-old reactor past failure know exactly how to make that reactor do something a reactor is never supposed to do. They had no army. They had no soldiers. They had no warships. What they had was a few thousand people who understood machines down to the bone, and a single, total, unshakable refusal to let their families be taken. The Thren leaned forward. Gaul's first dropship made it to the ground. The colonists let it land, and then they did something to the loading ramp with a cutting rig and an overcharged capacitor that I will not describe, because some of you are eating, and the 8 Ash Feeders inside that ship never came out. The second dropship tried to lift off when it saw what happened to the first. The humans had already gotten to the fuel lines. It made it about 40 meters up. The bar was silent. By the time the third ship understood what was happening, the Thren said, it wasn't a raid anymore, it was a hunt. And the humans were the hunters. They knew that ground. They knew that storm. They knew every tunnel and crawl space and maintenance shaft of the place they'd built with their own hands, and the Ash Feeders knew none of it, and the humans came at them out of the dust from every direction at once, with tools and traps and fury, and they did not stop. They did not negotiate. They did not break and run when they took losses, And they took losses, they bled. A soft species against armored guns, of course they bled. But every one of them that fell, the rest just kept coming. Over their own dead. Through the storm. Because somewhere behind them in those domes were the people they loved, and there is no force in this galaxy, none that I have ever found, that will turn a human away from a thing it loves once that human has decided to stand between it and harm. The Thren sat back. Gaul died in the dust, he said. 40 guns, armored, fed, and certain. A few thousand farmers and machinists with mining tools and reactors and rage. It took less than 2 hours. When the storm cleared at dawn, the colony was still standing. The light was still on in the windows and the ash feeders were gone. All of them. The galaxy's hardest crew, undone by the people they'd come to harvest. I looked at the human at the end of the bar. He was drinking, slowly, alone, with no idea. Dust on his boots. A courier. The most ordinary thing in the room. And I looked at him now the way you'd look at a calm pool of water after someone tells you what lives at the bottom of it. That should have been the lesson, the Thren said. And it was for a while. The consortium that funded the harvest, they learned that a colony of humans is not a soft target, it's a knife you swallow. They might have stopped there. The galaxy might have just quietly learned to leave the human worlds alone and gone back to easier prey. He turned the glass. But that wasn't the lesson. That was just the first half, because remember what Mara told me dying in the dust. She didn't say we'll fight you off. They did fight them off, but that wasn't the warning. The warning was the other thing. We always come back for our own. The Thren's pale eyes moved across the bar, slow. 6 weeks later, he said, the human lanes answered. I'd left the system by then, the Thren said. Contract complete. Mara confirmed. I'd taken my fortune and gone, and I'd put the whole strange night out of my mind the way you have to in this work. I told myself it was just an unusual job. I told myself I'd seen a colony get lucky against a sloppy crew. I told myself the dying woman's words were just words. He shook his head. Then the news came down the lanes. And I have been in this galaxy a long time, and I had never heard anything move the way that news moved. He set the glass down. The colony had sent a distress call the night of the raid. One call. Just before the ash feeders hit, before anyone knew if they'd survive, one of those engineers got a message out to the human lanes. Not a long one. Just, we are being hunted, these are the people responsible, this is who paid for it. Names, the consortium, the brokers, everyone in the chain. And then the storm and the fight and the silence. The Thren's voice was very quiet now. Humans, he said, do not have the biggest fleet in the galaxy. They never did. They're younger than most of us, fewer than most of us. They hold a smaller patch of stars than a dozen older powers. By the cold math of force, they are not the strongest thing out here. The choir is bigger. The old empires are bigger. On paper, the humans are a minor power, and a minor power that loses a colony grieves and protests and files its complaints and is ignored. That's how it goes. That's how it's always gone for every minor power in every age. He looked up. The humans did not file a complaint. What did they do? Vask asked. His voice had no fever left in it at all. They came back for their own, the Thren said. Every name in that distress call, every broker, every financier, every smiling official who'd signed off on harvesting a human colony because the math looked good, every one of them the humans found. It did not matter how powerful they were. It did not matter how far they ran, what worlds they hit on, what older empires they paid for protection. It did not matter that some of them had nothing to do with the raid itself, that they'd only signed a form, only moved some money, only looked the other way. The humans found them, all of them. It took years for some. They did not stop. They did not forget. They did not decide it was too expensive or too far or not worth it anymore. They had said a thing to themselves about their own people, and they meant it, and they collected the whole debt, to the last name, across the whole galaxy. And when it was done, they went home and turned the lights back on in the windows and grieved their dead and raised their young and started building again. The Thren turned the empty glass. And every old power that watched it happen learned the same thing at once, he said. You can beat a human. One human you can kill. I killed Mara. Didn't I? A colony of humans with enough guns you might even take if you don't mind losing most of your crew. You can win against humans. What you cannot do, what no force in this galaxy has ever managed to do, is finish it. Because killing a human doesn't remove a threat. It creates a debt. And humans collect every debt, every time, no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes, because somewhere down the line is a person who loved the one you killed, and that person will cross the whole galaxy and burn down everything you ever built rather than let it go. They do not do the math the rest of us do. They never have. They will spend a thing of infinite value, their own one short life, to settle a debt for someone already dead, and they'll do it gladly, and there is no threatening a creature like that, no bargaining with it, no winning against it in any way that lasts. The Thren leaned back. So I took the contract off my board, he said. Forever. I went back to my ship and I took a cutting torch and I burned 3 words into the spine of her, big enough that I'd see them every time I came home. Never hunt humans. Not because I was afraid of one. I've never been afraid of one. Because I finally understood the rule that the whole galaxy had to learn in blood. You don't hunt humans for the same reason you don't set fire to your own air. Not because the fire is strong. Because there's no putting it out, and it takes everything. And the only beings who win are the ones who never lit it. The bar was so quiet I could hear the recyclers breathing. And the human at the end of the bar, Eli, I learned his name was, later, finished his drink, and set down the glass, and reached into his satchel for the chits to pay, with no idea, none, that he'd just been the loudest thing in a room full of killers for the last 10 minutes. Vask stood up. I felt the whole bar tense. The Thren did not move. He just watched, those pale eyes on the Sethari, patient, waiting to see what a thing learns when it's been told the truth and the prey is 12 steps away. Vask looked at the human. The fever was gone from his eyes, but something else was there, pride maybe. The thing that had made him a captain. The thing that couldn't stand to be told there was a hunt he wasn't allowed to make. I watched him fight it. I watched the story wrestle with the pride right there on his face in the silence. And it was Sliss who broke first. Not Vask, Sliss. The little reptile, the one who laughed at everything, the one who'd been eyeing the door all night. Sliss decided, in the way that small, frightened, ambitious things decide, that the captain was hesitating and that maybe there was a name to be made by the one who didn't. He came up out of his chair fast, low, the way his kind move, and he had a blade out, a curved little skinning thing, a trophy-taker's tool, and he went for the human at the end of the bar. 3 things happened so fast I have spent years pulling them apart. The first, the human moved. Eli, the tired courier with dust on his boots. He didn't see Sliss in time to think. There wasn't time to think, but his body moved anyway, that old human reflex, and he got an arm up in the satchel between himself and the blade, and the blade went into the satchel instead of him, and he was already turning, already throwing his whole small weight backward into the little reptile. Because a cornered human does not freeze and it does not run, it fights, every time with whatever it has. And what Eli had was a satchel and his own body, and the absolute refusal to be killed quietly. The second, the Thren moved, and I have seen fast things in my life, station full of killers, but I have never seen anything like the Thren move. One moment he was sitting, patient, empty glass in his big gray hands. The next he was between them, between Sliss and the human, and I never saw him cross the distance. He just was there. And he had Sliss's blade arm in one of those slate-gray hands, and the little reptile was making a sound I'd never heard a living thing make, and the blade clattered to the floor, and the Thren had not even stood all the way up. And the third thing, the thing I will never forget, was the door. Because the moment Sliss moved on the human, the door of the long drop opened again, and this time 2 more humans came through it. Then a third. Eli's crew. A small freighter's worth of ordinary, tired, dusty people who'd been finishing their business on the docks and had felt, the way old Sib feels the cold come up through the floor, that something was wrong, that one of theirs was alone in a room full of the wrong kind of quiet. They came through that door fast, and they did not ask what was happening, and they did not hesitate. They just put themselves between Eli and the whole bar, all of them. A wall of small, soft, ordinary bodies, no armor, barely any weapons, against a room full of killers, and they stood. We always come back for our own. And I watched the entire bar, 200 hardened beings of the rim, smugglers and bounty crews and things with claws and guns. I watched all of them go very, very still. Because the Thren story was sitting in their bones now, fresh, and here it was again, live in front of them. 3 tired humans standing between their crewmate and death, perfectly willing to die there, all of them, every one, rather than let one of theirs be taken. Not because the odds were good. The odds were absurd. Because the odds were never the question. The question was never, can we win? The question was only ever, who is ours, and what will we not let happen to them? And once a human has answered that, there is nothing left to negotiate. The Thren let go of Sliss. The little reptile fell back against the table, cradling his arm, and the fever and the ambition had drained right out of him. And what was left was just a small frightened thing that had nearly made the oldest mistake in the galaxy. The Thren straightened up to his full height, and he looked at Vask. "There," he said quietly. "Now you've seen it, not in a story, with your own eyes, one human you cornered, and before he'd even finished bleeding, his people were through that door." He nodded toward the wall of tired, furious humans. "Look at them. No armor, no fleet. 3 against 200, and not one of them is going to move. They'll die right there, all of them, before they let you have the one behind them. Tell me, Sethari, with all your trophies, have you ever hunted a thing you couldn't make afraid?" Vask looked at the humans for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor. "No," he said, "I haven't." "Then learn the rule," the Thren said, "and live. Or hunt one anyway and find out for yourself what every dead crew before you found out. The galaxy is very wide. There is more easy money in it than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. There is exactly one kind of prey in all of it that turns into the thing that ends you the moment you touch it." He held Vask's eyes. "Leave that one alone, not because you're weak, because you want to grow old, and crews that hunt humans do not grow old. There is no such thing as an old human hunter. There's only the rule and the ones who learned it, and the long, long list of names of the ones who didn't." He glanced just for a second toward the door, toward his ship far below in the cradle, and I understood then what those scratched names on the hull had been. Not his kills. His warnings. Every crew, every warlord, every hungry hunter he'd talked down across all those centuries, and the ones he'd had to put down himself when talking didn't work. A list 1,000 long. The price of the rule, written in scars. Vask gathered the red tide with a look. They went, quiet, all the swagger gone out of them, Sliss last of all, cradling his arm, not meeting anyone's eyes. They filed out past the wall of humans, and not one of them so much as glanced at Eli, and the humans watched them go without moving until the door had closed and the docking clamps far below had released their ship into the dark. The Thren turned to the humans then. He crossed the bar slowly, big gray hands open and empty, and the humans tensed. They didn't know him, didn't know the legend, saw only a huge old killer coming toward their crewmate. They closed ranks tighter. The Thren stopped a respectful distance away, and he did a thing I had never seen the most feared creature in the galaxy do, a thing I'm not sure anyone had ever seen him do. He bowed his head. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "He's safe. It's done. I'm sorry it happened at all." And then to Eli, to the tired courier with the ruined satchel and dust on his boots, he said something so soft I almost didn't catch it. "There was a woman a long time ago on a world with no name. She kept 3,000 strangers breathing in a storm because she couldn't do anything else." He paused. "You move like her. You all do. I've spent 1,000 years learning to leave your kind alone, and I'd forgotten until just now that it isn't only fear that taught me. Go home, turn your lights on, live a long time. And he turned and he pulled his hood up and he walked out of the long drop, and I heard his ship, the scarred old bruise-colored thing with 3 words on its spine, release from the lower cradle a few minutes later and drift back out into the dark, slow, like it had all the time in the universe. I never saw him again. The humans left the next morning on their little freighter with a patched satchel and a story they probably told wrong because they never heard the part the Thren told us, the part about Mara and the storm and the names on the hull. To them, it was just a bad night in a rough bar, a near thing, a crewmate nearly lost and saved by a stranger. They never knew they'd stood in the middle of the most important lesson the galaxy ever learned. That's the thing about humans, I've come to think. They do the most extraordinary things. They walk into storms for strangers. They stand 3 against 200 for their own. And then they go home and call it Tuesday and never think about it again. They don't even know what they are. But the rest of us know. I've told this story 100 times since, down on the lower deck, to new lift tenders and board dock crews and anyone who'll sit still for it. And the young ones always ask me the same thing at the end. They ask if it's true. They ask if humans are really that dangerous, soft as they look, few as they are. And I tell them, you've got the question backwards, same as Vask did, same as the whole galaxy did. It was never that humans are dangerous because they're hard to kill. They're easy to kill. That's the whole trap. They look like the easiest prey there is. It's that you cannot kill enough of them. Because behind everyone is another who loved them, who will not do the math, who will not weigh the cost, who will cross the whole black sky and spend their one short life to settle a debt for someone already gone. And behind that one is another, and another, all the way down forever, an unbroken line of people coming back for their own. The Thren understood it before anyone, the most feared killer this galaxy ever made, and he spent his last centuries warning hungry young hunters away from the one prey that wasn't worth the price. 3 words on the spine of his ship, 3 words on the walls of warlords who never even knew where the rule came from. Never hunt humans. Not because they'll beat you. Because they'll love each other long after you've forgotten why you ever started. And that, in the end, is the one weapon in all the galaxy that nothing has ever learned to stop.